Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to talk about in this module are nuclear disasters, ghost cities, the Liquidators, Russian mobsters, radioactive wolves, and an abandoned city. We're going to talk about how the archaeological record forms, but instead of me merely giving you this sort of abstract idea of how it forms, I'm going to show you how it forms in real time after an entire city has been abandoned and the post-abandonment processes that have taken place there, as this abandoned city slowly becomes a pile of ruins on the plains of the northern Ukraine. There's the outline right up above me to serve as a guide for your notes, and let's go ahead and get started. A near perfect example of how cities fall apart is the ruined city of Pripyat on the plains of northern Ukraine. Pripyat is especially as important as it serves as a near perfect example of post-abandonment processes. Post-abandonment processes are defined as those C transforms and N transforms that continue to alter the dynamic archaeological record of a place after people have stopped living there. They've stopped living there, they've abandoned the city, but they still continue to make use of it. Now, the story of Pripyat starts in 1970. Pripyat, here's photographs of Pripyat when it was a living city. Pripyat was founded in the 1970s. It was founded in the year 1970. And it was a city built to be a model city showing the wonder and the beauty and the genius of Soviet communist thought and what exactly the communist empire could do when it set its mind to it. And that ended up kind of being true. Anyway, Pripyat was built as a city to service the workers of the people who were working at the nearby Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power station, which was placed on the border between Russia and the Ukraine inside the old Soviet Union. Here's the people having a foot race back in 1970 in the city center of Pripyat, and the nuclear power station was only 3 kilometers away from downtown. I mean, it was right there. And as a city, Pripyat was, I'm sure, a wonderful, beautiful place to live. It was only a city for 16 years. Because the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin power station is more popularly known as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And on April 26th, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. There are photographs, these are helicopter photographs from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And what you're looking at in this photograph, you are looking down into the heart of a burning nuclear reactor. So the reactor goes critical, it explodes. It blows the top off of the nuclear power station and ejects this column of highly radioactive dust, ash, and gas into the air. It rises in this huge column over the power station. Soviet firefighters, whose heroic bravery cannot be understated, Soviet firefighters attempted to contain the blaze, even though they knew that the radiation was killing them as they fought the fire. They attempted to fight the fire, but after a day of futile effort, they realized that they could only merely contain the burning nuclear reactor. They couldn't stop it. And after a day of futile effort, that huge column of ash and gas and debris began to move, and it began to drift over the city of Pripyat. The next day, the citizens of Pripyat were given 3 hours to evacuate their city before this column of gas and radiation and dust and ash collapsed across their town. And in a monument to Soviet efficiency, they did do this. They evacuated, tens of thousands of people from a city in 3 hours. And there you have a photograph of the people. They were only given a small case to take with them, getting ready to flee the city on board trains. This is going to be important later. They couldn't take any of their pets with them. And remember that. Soviet scientists, engineers, and the Red Army moved in an effort to contain the burning reactor, in an attempt to keep it secret, and in an attempt to massively clean up the disaster that was unfolding as the nuclear power station continued to burn. This group of soldiers, scientists, and workers were collectively known as the Liquidators. And here's your nightmare fuel for the weekend. These are the Liquidators themselves. These scary guys in hazmat suits, automatic rifles, attempting to remove and contain the burning reactor and the burning debris as much as they could during this futile 3-day effort. They realized that a lot of the people had actually let their dogs, their pets, go out into the street, and these animals were horribly contaminated with radiation. And so a lot of the soldiers simply started a policy of shooting the animals that they found in the ghost city of Pripyat. They could not really contain the reactor. All they could really do is sort of surround it and wait for the reactor to burn itself out, which they largely did. However, the area around the reactor, including the city of Pripyat, was horribly contaminated with this radioactive debris. So authorities sealed off a 30-kilometer circle around the reactor, which was called the inclusion zone. And there's a map of the inclusion zone right up above me. And there is a sign indicating you're at the limit of the inclusion zone. And there's the ghost city of Pripyat, irradiated, radioactive, and completely empty. So here's an entire city abandoned not just in 3 days, the entire city was abandoned in 3 hours. So the ghost city of Pripyat would seem a prime candidate for the Pompeii premise, indicating the sort of how life is frozen in a single moment as the city enters the archaeological record. It would seem that the city is a massive disaster accompanied by total abandonment of the city. So the city should be kind of frozen in place as life existed before April 26, 1986. But that's not true. The Pompeii premise is a false premise. The archaeological record is not static. Now, I can't actually take you to Pripyat. I can't actually, we can't actually get in a plane and fly there, not together, but I can show you what the city actually looks like today, which is what I'm going to proceed to do here. They often bring drone flights into the city itself, and I want you to watch and look at the ruins of Pripyat as they exist today, as seen by a robot drone. Now, as you watch that kind of drone fly through of this abandoned city, did you see any C transforms? Did you see any N transforms? Did you see the ways in which the archaeological record is being transformed and is being changed through time, as Pripyat is not a pristine ruin frozen in time from 1986? Now, it is still possible to visit Pripyat. Indeed, there's like something of a little bit of a disaster tourism industry where people fly into Kiev, into the Ukraine, and hire these companies to take them into the radioactive city. And now such trips tend to be quite short, so you don't absorb a lot of radiation. You have to bring Geiger counters with you if you enter an area that has a high degree of radiation. But yeah, there's a website right up there on the left of one of these companies that gives these little Chernobyl tours of this ancient abandoned city. And this is photographs from some of those tours as they take people. Oh, look, right up next to the old nuclear reactor. This photograph obviously dates from before the construction of the megatomb, which we'll talk about in just a tick. But here you've got people wearing various types of protective gear, taking photographs of the city center of Pripyat. You've got people up there where it's former Ukrainian and Russian army people giving tours. Now, the guides always carry rifles because there are hazards in the old city itself. And also, one of the things they have to do, from what I've read online, is that at the end of the tour, you have to take your shoes off and throw them in a big trash bag because your shoes might have picked up, radioactive dust and debris, and they don't want you taking that out of the inclusion zone. So let's talk about the C transforms. Let's talk about the N transforms that are currently taking place in this abandoned city. So right there is a communist cultural center. At the top is how it looks after about 30 years. At the bottom photograph is how it looked when it was still alive or when people still used it. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is we have this very surprisingly verdant return of flora across the city. Trees have sprouted in what were once parking lots, in asphalts, forming the concrete and asphalt apart, breaking it up as they sort of burrow down into the soil underneath all this concrete and asphalt. This has got a name to it. This is called bioturbation. There's the definition right up above me. Bioturbation are the acts of flora and fauna that physically move objects in the archaeological record. They break up architecture, they bury abandoned structures. If you ever wonder why archaeologists do so much digging, it's largely because the natural processes of the earth have buried these structures a very long time ago. Here's another structure from Pripyat. You can see all the streets and parks and lawns around it are now horribly overgrown. And in fact, in the abandoned city, it's more or less become something of a radioactive forest. You can see all these trees all around it. And indeed, notice that there's actually vegetation growing on top of the roof of that structure. There's little bushes, there's little grasses. Here's my question to you. Is that a C transform or an N transform? Decide right now and put that down in your notes. Here is the amusement park at the center of Pripyat. Please note how the grass and the trees have forced their way through the asphalt. And then what's going to happen is the trees are going to shed leaves, the grasses are going to die, and all of this material is going to die, it's going to decompose, and then serve as the foundation for succeeding generations of grasses, trees, plants, and bushes. What they're doing is they're creating a humic layer. And there right up above me, there's your humic layer. A humic layer is organic material that has decayed to form a rich topsoil, which then provides additional nutrients for successive generations of trees, plants, and bushes. And the point of a humic layer is when a humic layer is forming on top of structures, that almost always indicates that the structure is being abandoned. No one is taking care of the building, and the plants have begun to break down the structure and turn it into a scattered set of ruins on the landscape. Here's the steps leading up to one of these administrative structures. Please note that the plants themselves are growing into and through the steps leading to the entrance. And you've got large piles of dead leaves and dead grasses. That is all in the process of decomposing and turning into a humic layer. Plants and grasses are going to then grow on top of that humus. It's then going to, they're going to die. More leaves are going to be deposited. And within 10 or 15 years, all of those steps are going to be gone. They're going to be replaced by an uneven slope of grasses leading to the former entrance of this overgrown, abandoned structure. Here we have one of the main Communist Party centers, and you can see this nice level grass, this nice level field of grasses in front of the building. That's because all of those grasses are growing in a humic layer that is on top of a nice level asphalt parking lot. The parking lot has completely disappeared underneath a humic layer, and the trees and the plants are reclaiming all of this material. They're breaking it apart. They're reducing it to its component elements. Because the natural world is in a state of constant flux. It's usually just operating so slowly that we just can't perceive it on a human timescale. And what's going to happen is in another 25 years, the humus and the plants have begun to enter the first few floors of the building. Grasses and plants are going to accumulate on the roof. And eventually they're going to leave a humic layer on the roof. They're going to leave a humic layer on the first few floors. Plants will completely take over. The roots are going to push and exploit cracks in the concrete, in the cement. They're going to force the asphalt apart. And eventually they're going to get access to the steel infrastructure of the building itself. And they're going to begin to introduce water to that steel, the steel skeleton of the building, which will eventually corrode, and then the building is going to start to fall apart. Buildings don't fall apart all at once. They fall apart in stages. Different parts of them collapse at different times. And eventually this building will start to collapse. And what's going to happen is that the upper part of the structure is going to come down and basically mix with the humus in and around it, and it's going to form. It's going to bury the lower floors in the structural collapse from the upper floors. Ironically, this often preserves the lower pieces of architecture as they're buried from the rubble from the collapse of the upper architecture. And eventually what's going to happen is the whole building is going to come down, and then this huge pile of steel and concrete will itself be covered by another humic layer. So in 50 or 60 years, the building will be gone almost completely, and it's going to look like just another tree-covered mound on the landscape of the plains of northern Ukraine. One of the really alarming things, one of the really interesting things that happened inside the inclusion zone is, since people can't live there, or shouldn't live there, not if they don't want kids, has been the return of large animal populations to the area. Some of them have been introduced, some of them are natural, some of them have come in from elsewhere. And these have both entered into this sort of relationship with the natural environment. And indeed, sometimes they make the city incredibly dangerous. If you look up there on the upper left, one of the problems of Pripyat itself is that the liquidators didn't shoot all of the pets that were released in 1986. So what happened is that all of these pets, all of these dogs escaped. They went feral, interbred with local wolf populations, and have produced kind of a problem, which is that they've produced a city center that pretty much belongs to highly aggressive, radioactive, territorial wolf-dog hybrids. And there are some of them right there. These are extremely dangerous dogs because they're strong and they're big like wolves, but because they've got a lot of dog in them, they're not especially scared of people, and they will attack people. They have been known to attack people by themselves in the city center. This is why if you ever go on a tourist trip to Pripyat, your tour guide's going to bring a rifle. So the city center is overrun with these aggressive, territorial, radioactive wolf-dog hybrids. And indeed, many of the animals in the inclusion zone have been contaminated by radiation, but it doesn't really prevent them from living there and from breeding there. It does kind of, you know, snip off the last third of their lives, but they can still reach adulthood and father the next generation. And in addition to these kind of dangerous wolf-dog hybrids, you have boars. Wild boars now inhabit the inclusion zone. Very large, very aggressive, radioactive boars. But it also turned into the largest nature preserve in Europe. And indeed, it probably saved an entire species from extinction. There we have these little ponies you see there on the lower left. Those are known as Przewalski's ponies. They are wild horses who used to live all across Europe. But these little ponies have now found a home in the inclusion zone. And there they are. In fact, that structure right behind them, that's the Chernobyl power plant right there. So these ponies have developed the largest wild population of horses in Europe is now found in the inclusion zone around Ukraine. In fact, it probably pulled the species back from the brink of extinction. And yeah, they are radioactive horses, but again, that only clips off the last third of their lives. They can still be born, grow up, father the next generation. It's just that there are no old Przewalski's ponies in the inclusion zone. The story of Pripyat and Chernobyl in the inclusion zone gets too weird. It gets weirder and weirder every year. In an attempt to get rid of those aggressive wolf-dog hybrids, somebody got a visit from the Good Idea Fairy, and they decided to import Siberian wolves into the inclusion zone. And the thought was that the wolves would sort of outcompete the wolf-dog hybrids and sort of bring a little more sort of natural balance to this radioactive inclusion zone. It did not work. It turns out that the wolves and the wolf dogs kind of decided to share the territory. The wolf dog hybrids get the city itself, and everywhere outside the city there's now packs of radioactive Siberian wolves. And PBS made a very good documentary about the radioactive wolves. But they have prevented and they've kept the population of other animals down inside the inclusion zone, and they have predators inside the inclusion zone. So you're not going to have like population of herbivores aren't going to like explode, but all the animals are still radioactive. So I mean there is that. Now, why am I talking about animals? I'm talking about animals because the animals are a component of bioturbation. Remember, bioturbation is the acts of flora and fauna that transform and change the archaeological record. So what's happened is that, particularly during these really harsh winters in the Ukraine, the animals will force their way into these abandoned structures. Animals will break into the buildings. They'll force their way into, through windows and doors. Horses and elk will then follow and often use the buildings as shelter during very extreme winters. Some of these Przewalski's ponies have been noted as basically when a really severe winter storm comes, they'll actually go into the city and sort of pack themselves together in one or two of these rooms because the building will shelter them from the storm. Their body heat will keep the building warm. But of course, the same time they do that, they completely cover the floor of the building in fertilizer. And then once broken into, that gives plants the option of moving into the buildings themselves. Animals are going to rearrange artifacts in the rooms. They're going to change the rooms themselves. They're going to open the rooms to the elements themselves and allow vegetation to get into the structures. They're going to find this fertilizer-rich material. They're going to colonize it, and they're going to create plant life inside the structure itself. And if you look at this photograph right up above me, you'll see that that young tree is not outside of the building growing into the structure. It is actually inside the building, and it is growing out through one of the windows. And this is all changing the archaeological record of the structure itself, in this case, an old school. Here's the question. Here's my question for you. It's a very easy question. Is this a C transform or an N transform? Decide why, and put that down in your notes. You just don't have animals, you just don't have plants changing the archaeological record of Pripyat. You also have people themselves. People have continued to return to the abandoned city. Vandals have ransacked many of the structures. They go there, they get drunk, they break windows, they shoot windows out. A few buildings get periodically set on fire. And they bring spray cans and they paint graffiti on the walls of the structure. And here you have, I think that's one of the characters from The Incredibles. There's an old, I think that's maybe Gorbachev? I don't know. That's some local politician screaming at you in graffiti. They are altering these surfaces. In fact, I believe there's like an artists collective in Kiev. And every now and again, they'll go to this abandoned city. They'll go to Pripyat and kind of have sort of these graffiti contests to see who can paint the most interesting or shocking picture, and then they like win some sort of prize. Here's my question to you. Is this a C transform or an N transform? Obviously, this doesn't date from the period of the occupation. Putting graffiti on the side of structures like that back in the days of the old Soviet Union would earn you a quick trip to Siberia. So this is all post-abandonment process. Is it a C transform or is it an N transform? And why do you think that? And put that in your notes. Now, the attempt to contain the burning nuclear reactor proved quite costly. The resulting, all of these airplanes, all of these armored vehicles, all of this firefighting equipment, after it had been used, you can't reuse it again because it's all contaminated material. So there's nothing else to do than just dump it. All right. And here you see right above, this is an old photograph, but this is what they did to all of that army equipment after they did it. You couldn't actually use any of this stuff again because it was all contaminated. So they just parked it, left the keys in it, and walked away. And there you see on the upper left, these plants take over. And these grasses, these bushes, and these trees, they're slowly burying that little tank. It's getting buried. And the resulting garbage from all of this material was just dumped. It was all contaminated. Now, this is a process called dumping. And dumping is when people simply throw trash into old abandoned buildings. In fact, they do it all the time. I was once walking in downtown Dallas, and there was this big abandoned building. I think it was the old Dallas High School. It had been abandoned for decades when I walked by it, and I kind of peeked in one of the windows. It was full of trash bags. The local residents, instead of simply paying trash fees or paying a garbage company to haul their trash away, would often just bundle up their trash bag, walk across the street, and throw it in the old building. That's dumping. It's a very, very common practice in urban life. So here is all of that material from the firefighting getting dumped outside of Pripyat. Here's my question to you. Is this a C transform or an N transform? Why do you think that way? And put that in your notes. Now, if the Pompeii premise were true, and that the archaeological record is a direct reflection of ancient activities, then an archaeologist would excavate this school in Pripyat, notice that the floor of this elementary school is covered in firefighting equipment, gas masks, and hazmat suits, and immediately conclude, oh, this is where the elementary students must have kept gas masks and hazmat suits, correct? Of course, that is not correct. The dumped gas masks have absolutely nothing to do with the use of the school when it was actually operating as a school. What happened to the old elementary school is that the firefighters used it as kind of a base camp and a headquarters during the firefighting procedures. But again, all of their gear was contaminated. So when they decided to leave, they just stripped off all this material, threw it in an old classroom, and walked away. That is obviously a C transform. That's the firefighting gear is being dumped in the back of this old school. And it has nothing to do with the building's original purpose as an elementary school. Now, Soviet Union collapses in 1991. And for the better part of the 1990s, the inclusion zone around Chernobyl was left completely unguarded. And that's when looters moved in. Looters, backed by Russian mafia, moved in and began to periodically strip the buildings in Pripyat of anything that could be sold. They stripped it of all the scrap metal they could find. They were especially looking for copper, aluminum, brass, but they weren't above just taking plain old scrap steel. And Ukraine was cautioned. They said you need to protect the inclusion zone a little better. The Ukraine agreed. But then in 2014, the Ukraine basically lost a war with Russia, lost a bunch of its eastern provinces, and lost Crimea. And basically, the Ukraine, after it lost this war with Russia, has way better concerns than guarding the inclusion zone. And basically, since then, the inclusion zone is largely unguarded. And the looting of Pripyat has continued, as far as I know, to the present day. This was from a tourist blog that I looked at. It was somebody that was visiting Pripyat, and the group and the tour guide walked around a corner and bumped into the Russian mob, which was stripping this old apartment building of radiators. And in the blog, the tour guide looked at the mobster, and the mobster looked at the tour guide, and the tour guide turned completely around and said, "Everybody has to leave and don't take any pictures." Wow, they took this picture. They are looting the scrap steel from the apartment building. What they're going to do is take all this radioactive steel, load it onto a truck, move it out, sell it for scrap, and then it's going to get melted down and then mixed with non-contaminated metal, and then sold to some person who doesn't know they're buying slightly radioactive steel. So here's the question. Is this looting, is that a C transform or an N transform? Write down why you think why and put that in your notes. Here's the old gymnasium. Oh, they even took the basketball hoop. It was probably aluminum. They took the basketball hoop. Oh, man. They took the basketball hoop. Oh, and they took the aluminum from the sort of accordion bleachers. I don't know if your school had those. Mine did. Oh, they took all that aluminum. That's gone. Only the debris is left behind. Now, if you'll look on your left, that's the remains of an old concert hall. And it used to be packed with a veneer of marble, because marble has like really good like sound qualities. That's why they put it in like concert halls and stuff. So here's the old Soviet concert hall, and the looters took the marble. They stripped the marble from the sides of the concert hall and presumably sold it to someone, But the thing is that it's not like scrap steel where you can like melt it down and mix it with stuff that's not contaminated. It's marble. You can't, it's stone. So you look at this picture on the left, and that means somewhere out there, somewhere in the world, somebody got a great deal on marble and has absolutely no idea that it's probably radioactive. Oh, wow. If you ever come across a deal that seems to be too good to be true, it probably is. Now, altogether, all of these things are known as post-abandonment processes. Pripyat isn't anything near a pristine ruin. The archaeological record of Pripyat is not static. It is instead highly dynamic. And this is a great example of how dynamic the archaeological record is. There is this palimpsest of activity that's going on and is continuing to change the site. You have the city as it was before 1986. That's one depositional event. You have a second depositional event with the firefighting. And then you've got the looting, the bioturbation, the graffiti. All of these things are forming the archaeological record of this ghost city. Humans and plants are continuing to make use, they're continuing to change structures long after they've been abandoned, and while these buildings are in the process of decay. Now, like I've said, everything about Chernobyl, everything about Pripyat is just weird. It like doesn't even seem true. You have inclusion zones, you have ghost cities, you have radioactive wolf-dog hybrids, you've got tourists, you had liquidators, and now you have this thing, which they just built over the Chernobyl plant, which has become known as the megatomb. So not only do you have a radioactive inclusion zone, you now have the megatomb at the heart of the inclusion zone. Because what happened is that the old containment, the old containment procedures basically consisted of just pouring concrete on top of the old building and hoping it doesn't crack. Well, the old concrete containment over the burned out nuclear reactor started to leak and crack, and this was a problem. And Ukraine admitted that they didn't have the money to basically do anything about it. So the European Union came together in an effort to contain the radiation of the old burned out nuclear reactor and built this thing. They built this huge half cylinder, this huge dome structure across the entire old nuclear reactor. And it's become known as the megatomb, the huge tomb for this dead nuclear reactor. The megatomb at the heart of the inclusion zone, which includes the ghost city. Everything about Chernobyl is just weird and bizarre, and it even gets a little stranger. Because they have memorials. They will occasionally go into Pripyat and to honor the firefighters who heroically gave their lives to attempt to put out the fire, or at least to contain the fire. They'll remember the people who died from radiation in and around the city itself. And they'll put up these little Orthodox shrines and leave offerings of flowers at these shrines. So inside the ghost city, you've got wolf-dog hybrids, you've got a megatomb, you've got the inclusion zone. And every now and again, you have religious shrines scattered across the old city. Again, yet another, this reverence and veneration in honor of the victims of Chernobyl. This is yet another depositional event. Behold, Pripyat today, the model of what communism can do for the world. And Pripyat shows just exactly how complex these processes are that go on after a settlement has been abandoned. Buildings slowly fall apart. They're destroyed by the actions of flora and fauna. People return to modify surviving and decaying structures. And all of this impacts the formation of the archaeological record. So, from our sort of tour of Pripyat, from our tour of this ghost city, here's the question I want to ask you. What depositional events did you see that are forming the archaeological record for the ruined city of Pripyat? What I want you to do is pause, cogitate on this, and write down what some of these depositional events were, and identify them as either C transforms or N transforms. Now, I don't want to rag on the Ukraine too much. I don't want to rag on the old Soviet Union. They did things the way they did things. But you often have similar processes taking place, not in Ukraine, but in an American city. And in fact, we, in the next section, are going to visit the ruins of a spectacularly failed American city. Because in the next section, we are going to Detroit. And we're going to see how these same processes have gone on in an American disaster. And I will see you there.